Welcome to The Localist, a conversation with local makers and independent entrepreneurs. I'm your host, author of the Localist book, and former small business owner, Carrie Rollwagen. So today is an exciting episode for me because we're celebrating 10 years of The Localist. So 10 years ago this week is when the Localist book was published. And it's hard to believe it's been 10 years. You may or may not have know that the Localist podcast started with a book and the podcast came later. That's a story for another time. But today, to celebrate 10 years, I wanted to share with you 10 things I've learned in 10 years of the Localist. So the Localist, as we've said, is a book. It's also a podcast. We do a lot of social media. And so it's been spreading this kind of message of buying local for a long time. And there are a lot of things that I've learned that I apply to the business that I run in my day job, Infomedia. And I also apply to side hustles I do, and that also kind of come up all of the time with Localist guests. So I thought it would be kind of fun for me to kind of go back through the things I've learned, and hopefully can also help you whether or not you are just doing a project or a side hustle or it's a business. And one of the things that I've learned, this is actually not one of the 10, is that something can morph from one thing to another, because that's kind of what the Localist has done. It's been all of those things. Okay, so we have 10 things to get through. Let's jump in. And yes, I have note cards because I'm that person. Because if I just tried to wing it, I'd end up with 8 things or 12 or something like that. All right. So the first thing that I have learned is that people aren't paying that much attention to you, and that this is a good thing and a bad thing. So it's a quote unquote bad thing when we want to put out content, we're putting out a reel, we're putting out a podcast, and people seem not to care. Yes, some people care, but there are some episodes that I've been like, this is so good, I really love this, and they don't perform. Or maybe they just perform the same as any other episode. And sometimes that's disappointing. And you just kind of have to roll with it. This has been a long game. Like we've said, the Localist has been around for 10 years. So of course there are going to be episodes that don't perform the way I think they're going to, or the way I wish they would. There are some things that I think are really important that my audience doesn't agree are as important. And that's just part of the game. But on the other hand, people aren't paying that much attention to my failures either. I think I naturally, and I think so many of us think we don't want to mess up. We want to do everything perfectly because what happens, it would be so embarrassing if we didn't. But here's the thing, people just really aren't paying that much attention. Most of us are thinking about ourselves and not necessarily, you're probably thinking more about embarrassing things that might have happened to you than you are thinking, wow, Carrie really stumbled on those words in the Localist podcast. Those are things that I'm going to notice a lot, but other people aren't going to notice. So knowing that has allowed me to try more, to experiment more, knowing that if only a few people come to my book signing, or if a podcast episode doesn't do as well as I thought it would, or if a reel that I worked on a lot and I was really excited about didn't perform, that's okay, and no one notices that as much as I notice that. It's really not that big of a deal. Okay, number 2. Following wild ideas can pay off, but not necessarily in money. So part of this is my own fault because the Localist is a passion project for me. I consider it to be a sort of journalism more than I do a business, and I approach it that way. But there are so many things that I've thought oh, I know, I'll just write a book. Or after I launched the book, I went on a tour. I decided to go on a tour from New Orleans to New York, take the train and stop in cities along the way. It was just this weird concept. I was like, this seems quirky and interesting enough that I can probably get some press out of it. And I did it. And I stopped in big cities and big bookstores and small bookstores in New York, Boston, Philly, DC. I didn't have connections in those places. I had some connections in Birmingham. I had some connections in New Orleans. But I booked signings in these huge stores like Atlanta, everywhere. And I just made those things happen because I thought it would be cool. It was an out there idea, and it totally worked. Now, did it work in that I made $1 million? No. I made $1,000 or somewhere more in that neighborhood. Like, it paid for itself. When people ask me, did I make a lot of money on the Localist book? What I say is, like, yes, I did make a profit on the Localist, including like doing the tour and all of that stuff. But I didn't make a living off of it. I still had to have another job. So, but this paid off in so many other ways in my life. Like, I have the job I have now because of the Localist, because of the work I was doing with local businesses, and that was noticed by my boss. So there are so many things that came from the Localist, not necessarily money. So that's important to remember, I think, whatever you're doing, especially if you're doing something like a passion project like this. Okay, number 3, good ideas will wait for you. This is something, so there's a book called Big Magic, and I actually really like this book. But in that book, there's the idea that if you don't grab an idea immediately when it comes to you, it might leave you, and you will not be able to revive that idea. I do think creatively, sometimes that happens. But I also think there are ideas that just really aren't the right time for us that really are great ideas. So for example, before I had the Localist book, I had a blog called Shop Small where I only bought from locally owned stores for a year, and I blogged about it. That's what would eventually become the Localist book, the Localist podcast, all of this. I wanted to do that project for probably 5 years before I actually did it. But I put it off because I thought it would be too expensive, and I didn't have a well-paying job at that point, and I didn't think it would be responsible for me to do it. Now, fast forward to when I had a better paying job, I did the thing, and it worked. And it happened that when I did that thing was the same year that we opened Church Street Coffee and Books, so it went together really well, and then that led to the Localist book. So all of these things I wanted to do for a while, and it's in my nature to try to force things as soon as I think of them. And sometimes we do have to grab that idea when it's right there. I'm not saying every idea is going to wait for you, but some ideas, when you're just like, I have a passion for this, but I just can't do it right now, sometimes ideas will wait for you. I forgot what number I'm on, but next number. Make your message strong and be flexible in how you tell the story. So the Localist message has really not changed since the very beginning. The world has changed a lot. And the thing is, like, for example, my husband is like, you should do an update on the things about the Localist book, what is different now. And I actually reread the book to try to find the things that are different now, or I looked at different parts in the book. I didn't read it front to back. But most of the things I said then, because I was talking more about principles than I was talking about exact facts, most of the things are actually still accurate. I would still totally stand behind them. My message that buying local matters, it matters economically and it matters for our communities, that has stayed the same. But I have had to be very flexible in how I told it. I started with a blog, that year-long blog. That turned into a book. I had to totally rewrite it for a book because I tried to just throw those blogs into a book format and it was terrible. So I had to tell the story differently when it came to a book. And then this became a podcast and I had to tell the story differently again. I focus on different things. I am not as preachy, not always on a soapbox. I don't talk about Amazon that much on the podcast. So the format did have to change a little bit. And now I also tell the story through Reels and social media. And then that has to change a little bit as well. So this is something I actually learned from Marshall McLuhan, who is this journalist, thinker person, that he says the medium is the message, which means when we are using a different medium, we have to tailor the message for that medium. We can't just I couldn't just pick up this book and read a chapter on the podcast. It just wouldn't work the same. So knowing that has been so helpful in me approaching different mediums. But also this is helpful to be able to roll with the punches when algorithms change. Yes, when Instagram changes their algorithm, it is very frustrating for me too. I'm not just saying that I'm just like, oh cool, no big deal. But generally I try to see it as a challenge instead of a roadblock, and that attitude does really help me, and that's something I've learned through this process. Another thing I've learned, speaking of algorithms, well-rounded content does not usually perform very well on social media. So one of the things I try to do at The Localist is to be fair, to be balanced, to show both sides of the story. These are not the things that perform very well. What performs well on social media is if I took a very polarized, extreme stance and delivered it in a really explosive way. That would get me more followers. I probably couldn't live with myself. That's not what I want to do. But I need to realize that this is a trade-off that I'm making. That if I try to make content that's about something I really believe in and that's important to me, it may be fulfilling. It is fulfilling in so many ways. But it's not necessarily going to perform super well on social media, maybe even on the podcast, maybe on a blog, etc. It's not going to perform as well as polarized content would. And that took me a long time to understand, because for a long time I was like, I feel like I'm doing the right things. I feel like I have good listeners, good, followers, all of the things, and people are engaged. And I had to realize it's not that I'm doing it wrong. I'm doing this right. Of course, there are things I could learn about. I can always do better. But for the most part, this doesn't really have to do with me doing a good job at the podcast or not, or doing a good job with Reels or not. It's just the kind of content that I am trying to provide, while important, is not necessarily the kind of content that's going to go viral. And that's okay. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop doing it. Okay, next, I have learned that it's helpful to know how to do a little bit of everything, but that doesn't mean you have to do everything. So let's take this year, for example. I've really dived in to try to learn how to edit Reels, how to add music, how Reels should be structured, a little bit more about podcasting, a little bit more about YouTube. And I've tried to do at least a little bit of all of the jobs that are involved in putting the podcast together. That is really helpful on weeks like actually this one, where our promotions manager has strep throat. So she's not able to do some of those things. Now I can come in and pinch hit and do those things. So it's helpful that I know how to do them. It also helps me to brainstorm better ideas with the rest of my team when I actually know a little bit of the mechanics of the kinds of work that they're doing. So it is really helpful for me to learn some of these things, but it's also helpful for me to let some of them go and not feel like I have to control everything all of the time. Okay. The next one is stolen from my husband, and that is that you can't play baseball and complain that you didn't get a touchdown. This does a little bit go back to the rewards and what you can actually achieve on social media. Because for a long time, I was putting together a podcast and putting together social media, and I'm like, why am I not getting the results that other people are getting, that other podcasts are getting? And in meeting with business managers and talking to friends and talking to advisors, this is really what a lot of it came down to. Now, yes, there are other things I could do. I'm not at all saying I'm perfect, I've done everything. But most of what it came down to is the topic that I'm talking about. Like, I'm playing baseball. I'm talking about buying from local businesses. This is going to have a different kind of audience than if I were talking about celebrity gossip, for example. But those were the people I was comparing myself to. And I need to stop that. I either need to say, if I want a touchdown, I need to start playing football. And if I'm insisting on playing baseball, I need to aim for a home run instead. So defining those metrics of success based on what you're actually doing instead of comparing yourself to the most successful person out there has been really important. There are a lot of rewards in what I do, but the rewards are a bit different than I thought they would look. Okay, this is something that is hard to grasp, but if you've done anything, put any content out there, or started a small business, you already know. Lots of your friends will not support you, but lots of other people will. This is just the thing. Your friends, like, what I wish is that my friends liked all of my content, actually listened to the podcast, maybe not every episode, but at least, like every 5th episode. I wish when they saw something that they thought was interesting that they would share that episode, because those shares and those reviews on social media are so powerful. But the fact is, my friends don't do that. And that doesn't mean they don't love me. That's not meaning they're not my friends. It's not even meaning they're not being supportive. It's just that we need to, first of all, just having relationships with somebody doesn't mean that they have to like every single thing I do on social media. Doesn't mean that they have to consume the content that I'm creating. And it is important, if you do have a boundary, sometimes I actually ask for those things. Sometimes on my birthday, I will say publicly on social media, what I want for my birthday is for you to share a Localist podcast episode that you like. But you do have to actually spell those things out. Like when I launched my writing guide, I actually texted a few friends and said, I put a lot of work into this. If you could share it, it would mean a lot to me. Now, I only texted about 3 people that because I still felt awkward saying that. But I have learned that if you want the feedback from your friends, you're going to have to directly ask for it. For the most part, they are not going to realize that they need to do it. Now, yes, there are exceptions. I have friends who are like super loyal listeners. I have friends who are very, very supportive. I even have a friend who doesn't listen but makes sure to play all the podcasts so I get the algorithm boost from it. So there are just different ways of being supportive. But I think when we start something, we think our friends are going to be so into this. And that's fine to think, but you probably will be disappointed. But there will be other people who kind of come out of the woodwork. Some people who maybe are acquaintances and not super good friends, and some people who are strangers who will become really big supporters of your work. And that is exciting to see. So most of these things that you've noticed have like 2 sides of a coin kind of thing. So yes, your friends will probably not be your biggest fans, but that doesn't mean you won't have fans. And that doesn't mean that both are not important. Okay. Celebrate the small wins. This is something that is still really hard for me. I'm really known for just moving the goalpost, and as soon as I get somewhere, just getting on to the next thing. But celebrating the small wins. Like today, okay, 10 years of The Localist is more than a small win. It's kind of a big deal. But still, today I'm actually taking the time to record a podcast, to put a podcast out there, which, full disclosure, was not even on our schedule this year. But I thought this is important. This is an important moment to notice, because when I take a moment to notice it, it like does something to my brain and shows me like this is a home run if we're going to really belabor the baseball football analogy. I need to celebrate the home runs. I don't need to continually just complain that I'm not getting a touchdown. So those small things, if it's your 10th episode, 50th episode, 100th episode, celebrate that. Celebrate the people on your team. We had a lunch with the Localist team recently where I gave them all a pair of Zaccano socks because we had Zaccano on the podcast. We had a good lunch. We talked about what we were going to do in the future. And it was so great. It was one of the best things that I've done, honestly, this whole year. And it was just taking time to celebrate. We're coming to the close of a season. We're back. We did a whole year back of the Localist, and it was really good to acknowledge that. And those small wins are really important. And not the last thing I've learned from the Localist, but the last thing on my top 10 list is that unexpected endings sometimes just start new chapters. There are a lot of odd things that kind of happened through the Localist journey. When I published the Localist book, when I wrote the first draft, I was going to stay at Church Street. And the end of the book was this happy ending about like, I'm a bookstore girl and, I own this bookstore and everything's wonderful. And then during the time from first draft to the first edit, things started to not be great at Church Street. And I ended up deciding to sell. And so during this time, I was making that decision while I was finishing up the book. I had to change the ending to be more of a kind of murky ending, so it was still a true ending. While this was happening, I was out there promoting the Kickstarter campaign for the Localist acting like everything was so happy when really I was terrified that I was going to lose this thing that I had built, that it was going to be so bad. But so much good came out of my moving on from Church Street. Like, first of all, I was free to do the book tour, to do the train tour. I didn't have to worry about Church Street. I probably wouldn't have met my husband if if I had still been chained to the shop all of the time. That's around the time we met. I started this new position at Infomedia right after I got back from the book tour. And so this is I've been able to develop this in other ways. So at the time, I thought this is like a closed door, and it felt really final and really depressing, but really was just ushering me into a chapter that was actually in so many ways better and opening me up to new things. And kind of the same thing with the podcast. Like, I started the podcast, and about a year ago, we've done the podcast again for a year, but a couple of years ago, I decided to step away and work on other projects. And I thought that was sad. That was an ending. There were a lot of things that I had very mixed emotions about. And then a year after I decided to stop the Localist, my boss at Infomedia came to me and said, hey, I would love for you to start this again. And so now we're back in a new way, and I have a whole new team working with me. And there are so many things that we've added this year. We've really jumped into social. It's just been really exciting. We've done YouTube. I've learned more about video. So it wasn't the end, it was actually a beginning, but I didn't know that at the time. So knowing how to recognize, okay, this is the end of a chapter, but it's not the end of my life. Like, there are other things that I can do, have been really helpful, and that's something that I've really, really learned through the Localist journey. Okay, so those are 10 things I've learned with 10 years at the Localist. And I hope there are so many things I've learned also about small businesses, small business owners, and I hope that you have too. Thank you for being with us through this whole journey, and thank you for being with us today. The next few weeks, we're going to have some Christmas stories on the podcast, so I hope you'll be with us for those as well. The Localist podcast is produced by me, Carrie Rollwagen. We record right here at Infomedia Studios. If you need podcasting, video for your business, photos for your business, or any help with your website, we would love to help. Infomedia is the podcast sponsor, and you can find out more just by visiting infomedia.com and then filling out the contact form, letting us know what you need. The Localist is not just put together by me. We have a whole team, as I mentioned. Our showrunner is Taylor Davis. Jen Tucker is our outreach manager. Elena Harmon is our marketing and promotions manager. And again, we record right here at Infomedia Studios. Find me at, carrierollwagen.com. It's my name. You'd think I would remember. And you can also find me on social media at CRollwagen. So until next time, here's to thinking global by acting local and putting small shops before big box.